Great, so our second paper then is titled Exploring the Effects of Chronic Wartime Stress on Sexuality and Relationships in Israel. Will you join me in welcoming Tali Rosenbaum?
Okay, just gonna. Wow, I'm really excited to be here. And I want to start my presentation with addressing the elephant in the room. I am going to be talking about the experience of Israelis because that's what I know and that's what I've studied. But I do believe that we should acknowledge that there is a great deal of suffering as a result of war everywhere. And I just want to say that. I want to acknowledge the suffering of innocent civilians in Iran, in Lebanon, and in Gaza. But I am going to be talking about Israelis. Since the traumatic events of October 7th, people in Israel have been living with ongoing reality of threat, of stress, displacement, sirens. And since that day, we've had a lot of kind of talking and thinking about trauma, also in the mental health community, obviously, but also in the lay community. But the thing is that trauma doesn't just live in the individual. Trauma affects relationships. And we know this even in Israel from research so long ago. Professor Zahava Solomon studied longitudinal effects of trauma on couples from way back from the Yom Kippur War, and found that partners of people with PTSD, of combat veterans with PTSD, also developed symptoms of PTSD. But in those days, we weren't even talking about PTSD, we weren't even talking about, and certainly they weren't talking about sex. In those days, men didn't even, I don't think people really talked about their feelings as much as we do today. But we do know that trauma itself disconnects, it dysregulates, and it makes it hard for relationships. So at a time when we really need connection, and many of us want connection during very difficult times, those are times where it is very, very hard to connect. And so since I am a sex therapist and a couples therapist, I'm mostly a clinician. I love to do what I do, but I also have participated in quite a bit of research. And I was interested in something different. I was interested to know when the war started is how does stress and trauma affect relationships and affect sexuality, not with PTSD. PTSD is after the source of stress is no longer and we still have symptoms. But what happens during the ongoing threat? And what happens to people when you can't really ever relax or calm down? So what I'm going to do today is try to bring together three things. I'm going to talk about what we already know from our research about sexuality and PTSD, and what we are seeing clinically and also based on our research about how the war is affecting couples. But I also want to talk about the meaning of sex, because sex is not just about sex. I mean, people might ask, why are you even studying sex during a time of such existential fear and grief and difficulty? And what I would say to that is, it's exactly when we should study sex, because sexuality is about vitality. It's about seeking to be alive when you're not even so sure that your boyfriend or husband is going to come back. And so we really appreciate it, especially as Jews. Sex is about recreation and connection, but it's also about procreation. It's also about building. This was after the Holocaust as well, why families have 12, 14 children, to rebuild our population after such devastating loss. So it's also about attachment, about regulation, and really about healing. Now, the traumatic events of October 7th and more than 2.5 years of war has wired us differently. I was walking yesterday, I heard a siren, and I jumped, because the sirens here, the ambulances sound like the siren that we have when we have to run to the safe room. So the thing is that it's very adaptive for us to have these responses. We've adapted responses of hypervigilance because that's how we survive. But I think that what we know as couples therapists, and Terry Real says this all the time, that adaptive symptoms, that what's adaptive for survival It's not adaptive for couples. It's not adaptive for intimacy. So not all of us have PTSD, but there's a spectrum of symptoms. And so what trauma dysregulates, and we need to, and it makes us sometimes defensive and reactive, and we know that those things are not relational. And we also know that not everybody reacts the same way because of their attachment. So people who are anxiously attached seek a lot of connection with their partners in order to feel better, but people who are avoidance, they more need to calm down on their own. And what do you know, how are these people always married to each other? But they are. So, these people meet in relationships, and it's very difficult because their responses to trauma are very different. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what we already know about PTSD and sexual function. And this is a study that I wrote together with Professor Rachel Yehuda, who is a very well-known trauma researcher, and also my sister. And what we showed, we studied the neurophysiology of sexual arousal, and we compared it to the neurophysiology of PTSD. And what we found is kind of why they are not, compatible. Because sexual arousal involves responses, your heart rate goes higher, and you feel like you're in a stress response. You kind of go into fight, flight, but you don't. Because when you're not traumatized, you know that it's just a ride that you're going on. You're going to have fun, you're going to enjoy, you're going to have an orgasm, and you're not unsafe. But for people with PTSD, once their physiological reality mirrors the fight-flight response, they can go into a trigger. Their anxiety can create an inability to let go and relax. They don't have that down regulation. They feel like they're now in the combat. And so this explains why PTSD is an independent risk factor for sexual dysfunction. But again, right after October 7th, we weren't talking about PTSD yet. We were still in the trauma. And there was still ongoing threat and ongoing symptoms of acute stress disorder, which is a misnomer because it's not a disorder. When you're in acute stress and you have symptoms, you're supposed to have those symptoms. They help you survive. So as clinicians, and also as a researcher, as clinicians, we saw the immediate response to stress in our couples and what happens, but we really wanted to know what happens to people's vitality, need to connect when they're worried about sirens and looking at video clips which are disturbing. And so I got together with a couple of, again, I'm not a big researcher, but my colleagues and friends are, and I got together with Dr. Ateret Gewurz-Medan and Professor Arya Lazar. They are both well-known researchers. And we conducted a couple of empirical studies examining how acute stress, trauma exposure, and media exposure during the war were affecting sexuality and intimate relationships. We sent out 1,200 questionnaires, and we sent questionnaires to 1,200 Israeli adults, and we wanted to look at those findings. I'm just going to go through that really quickly and then talk about clinical things that are important about the clinic. So we fully expected that acute stress symptoms would be the strongest predictor of sexual problems, but we interestingly found that what was really predictive for sexual distress was media exposure, even more than actually direct exposure. Looking at graphic, disturbing images over and over again is one of the strongest predictors of distress, and watching materials keeps the nervous system in a state of activation all the time. And that has a direct effect on desire, arousal, and orgasm. Also, people would say to me, when I'm trying to have sex, I'm getting an image of the graphic, violent things that they saw, and they weren't able to have sex. In another study, we looked at sexual frequency, and we looked at both individual and partner. And what we found was very interesting. About half of the participants said that there was no change in their sexual activity. A little less than half did report a decrease, and a very small group reported an increase, although those who reported an increase, it was more in masturbation and non-partnered sexual activity. So emotional reasons that were cited: sadness, anxiety, feeling it was wrong to experience pleasure when there were, captives, in the tunnels and other people were suffering. And also practical reasons. We are evacuated to a hotel, or with all our kids in the same room, or we might have to run to a safe room in the middle. And so sometimes the impact is not only psychological, it's also logistical. And what was really the most interesting though, is that we found that there was not a single response, there was a lot of variability. Okay, so we see this variability clinically as well in our couples, and what we're seeing a lot is that usually it's the male partner, sometimes it's the female partner, but they're going in back and forth, they're going to reserve duty. And so when they go to reserve duty, they're there and they're soldiers, and as a soldier, you're in a very different reality than your wife at home with the kids is in. When you're a soldier, you're very focused on what you're doing, and you're in a survival mode. You don't think about your body because you can't always eat or drink when you want. And the wife at home with the kids is doing everything, often alone, going to work, taking care of the kids, and then they come together. And they want to meet together, but they can't meet because they're in two completely different worlds. And often they're kind of like in a competition for who's had it worse. And it's not that they don't want to connect, they do, but they can't connect. And very often we hear, you're not the same person. And in a way that's true. None of us is the same person, but it's not a permanent. It's like how we've adapted. And psychologically, there's a transition, and it takes time. And usually by the time they're back together, the partner, he has to go back to the reserves. And also sometimes, and by the way, for religious Orthodox couples who their sexual lives are connected to the rhythm of the menstrual cycle, often the husbands come home exactly at the wrong times. And so that's very disruptive to the couple as well. And it's very difficult for them to be, to keep their fealty to Jewish law. So the truth is that for soldiers, it is very, very difficult. And I'm going to go through some of what we're seeing in our soldiers. Often the intimacy is channeled towards one another rather than to their partner, because only their army buddies can really understand what's going on. Their partners can't. You just can't understand. So there's the impact of trauma, dysregulation, hypervigilance, anxiety, and that makes it difficult to connect. Avoidance can extend into relationships, which creates emotional and physical distance. Many of our soldiers are coming back with a lot of anxiety, depression, and unfortunately there are experiences of moral injury, feelings of guilt, shame, and internal conflict, and those are very difficult to talk about. There are physical injuries, sometimes genital injuries, and sometimes that shifts the role of the couple because the partner becomes the caretaker. So what we're seeing when we step back is not just one issue, it's a convergence of psychological, physiological, and relational factors, all affecting the capacity for connection at the same time. So the question then becomes, what determines whether people move towards each other or away from each other under stress? So clinically, I think what I'm seeing is that there are at least three factors. There's the nervous system. Obviously, if you're above the window of tolerance, hyper-aroused, you can't connect. If you're below the window of tolerance, hypo-aroused, you're shut down, and sexuality is very different. The second is attachment. When people are afraid of losing each other, some people move closer and some people move away, and people with more anxious attachments seek the physical closeness and sex as reassurance. People with more avoidant attachment may withdraw. And the third is the meaning of sex. Many of you may be aware of Metz and McCarthy. They talked about the good enough sex model and the different meanings to sex. And we can value very different meanings for sex. Sometimes it's about connection, sometimes it's about pleasure, sometimes it's about obligation or stress relief, or some it's about feeling alive. So sexuality under stress is not just a sexual behavior. It's about attachment, it's about regulation, and it's about the nervous system. And sometimes you can't connect if you feel guilty or you feel exhausted. And sometimes people just want sex because they're confronted with death. There's so much variability and there's not one response. But what we do want to do clinically is we want to help our couples establish connection, because ultimately that's what heals. And I'm sorry to quote scripture, but God said it's not good for man to be alone, right? So we're not meant to go through these difficult things alone. And I do want to say a word about singles. There was an app that was developed in the past conflict with Iran that singles could find each other in the safe rooms if they happen to be in the same safe room, kind of like a Tinder for the safe room kind of thing. People look for partners, but it's been very hard for singles to date. The men come back from war, they're not really present, and they see other couples and they're jealous because they don't have anybody. So I do want to acknowledge that, because it's difficult for singles to find a partner during this time. On the other hand, people do make quick connections and they don't always last. So from a clinical perspective, these findings suggest that sexuality under trauma is not just about sexual functioning. It's about the nervous system, attachment, grief, guilt, fear, and meaning. We have to help couples understand that many sexual problems during periods of stress are not really sexual problems. They're stress, trauma, and reintegration problems that show up in the sexual relationship. We need to work with regulation, helping people calm their nervous systems, feeling safer in their bodies, feeling safe with their partners, because without a sense of safety, sexuality is very difficult. We need to work with communication, with vulnerability, especially when one partner has been in combat and the other's been at home. And we need to remember that the opposite of trauma is not sex. The opposite of trauma is connection. And sex is sometimes one of the ways that people create connection, but it's not the only way. Resilience does not mean, it's not the absence of pain, but it's the ability to move forward and create meaning in the face of adversity. And that's what I think sexuality and connection is about. It's about resilience. It's about creating this vital life force in the face of adversity. So our role is not only to treat dysfunction, it's to help people understand what's happening to themselves and to each other. Because when people understand, they're less afraid. And when they're less afraid, they can reconnect. As Judith Herman wrote, recovery from trauma takes place in relationships, and very often, recovery takes place in the context of intimate relationships. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
I imagine your research didn't look into this, but the thought that came up from you were talking about the largest predictor of difficulties was media consumption. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, like what is this doing to diaspora Jewish populations, and like what type of wartime stress, like what does that look like?
So
but also in general, like
I'm glad you asked, because the truth is I just gave a talk for which was for the Jewish world, and it happens to be that there is a ripple effect to Jewish families and couples on many levels, relationally. Also because of anti-Semitism and because of what they're experiencing. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up and acknowledged it, because we are looking at that too. And certainly Jewish therapists around the globe are seeing a lot of these issues crop up, and also relationally. And relationally, by the way, is not just in intimate relationships, but even in family relationships, because people's political beliefs change, their value systems change, and this can create conflict within relationships. But in terms of predictors, one thing I didn't say is like what predicts whether couples, when they need to connect so badly, either don't connect or do. And I think that the predictor is what things were like before. If couples were open and communicative and prioritized intimacy and sexuality, then it's very likely that their resilience factors are going to kick in and create a more stable connection. Okay. Thanks for the question. That was important. Any other questions? Yes.
I'll be compliant.
Okay.
Unusually. You talked about fight and flight.
Yes.
What we also see is freeze.
Yes. I like freeze. That is
Where there is a rigidity in
a shutdown.
yes,
Yes.
couples, and so their availability to each other
Exactly.
is really impacted.
Yes.
And I wonder if you saw that in...
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, when you are in fight-flight and you are in a hypo-aroused state, that's going to make it difficult to connect because you will be reactive and defensive and in fight mode or runaway mode. I had a couple on October 8th who came into the office. I didn't think I was going to be working that day, but people did not cancel. And they were up all night because he is like classically the flight mode guy. And he would like not show up the day they moved apartments. He ran off. He was always running away when things got tough. And he was up all night trying to get tickets to go back to America. And she was, no, we have to stay. We have to volunteer. So certainly these different responses, the shutdown versus the overreactive, they do meet each other and it makes it very, very difficult. Yeah, so these are also linked to different attachment styles as well. Any other questions? Yes.
Kelly, how often do you find that couples do come in and deal with this issue when they find they're not connecting, especially with women, the offing and stuff?
Couples therapists in Israel and sex therapists as well are dealing with this issue all the time. In fact, the Army is now paying for couples therapy for like 6 sessions or however it comes out to be, because it is known to be a very, they just know that this needs to happen. It's really kind of crazy situation, even like for girls, who are dating soldiers. Usually when you go on a date, you expect the guy to come and pick you up, or you meet at a cafe. There are young women going to Army bases to be able to meet their dates because they can't get out. So there's been a lot of adjustment, and there's also been a lot of awareness. And so I think that as a couples therapist in Israel, we deal with this all the time with the different responses, with the differences of their lived experiences, because they're so diverse. When you're at home and when you're out on the battlefield, your lived experience, your embodiment of how you do your fight flight really does meet and then doesn't meet. So thanks for that question. One last question? No? Oh, Shoshana?
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you and how applicable it is in outside of Israel too, especially in the community that I live in. There were definitely people who went back to Israel and their spouses stayed, and it was complicated to come back after the spouses were very, very alone for a few months. They didn't even necessarily have parents or other family members to help them with their kids, and then they were on such different pages, or the ones who wanted to go back, and their spouses were like, "You cannot go back again." And so really is so applicable, and also the idea of the stress response being similar to the sexual arousal response, and how I found that a really helpful thing to think about, and like what might be.
Yeah, I would refer you to for anybody who's interested, to the 2015 paper in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, PTSD and Sexual Dysfunction for Men and Women, where we explained that whole system, because really sexuality is a lot like a car, right? There's the brakes and there's the gas, and you need to have the brakes. And the down regulators on the brakes, they tell you that you're not in a stress response. This is just sex.
Right. So it's super helpful to think about. I also just wanted to piggyback on the media exposure thing, because on the one hand, of course, in terms of the exposure to war, exposure to trauma, but I'm also thinking about just even beyond that, like how we know that younger people are having less sex now, and they're also very attached to social media, and they're constantly attached to their screens, and how this is applicable even to not war. Right.
Right. That's a whole other discussion. Is just social media and how that affects and takes away from intimacy. From emotional intimacy, from connection, from looking at each other in the eyes, from talking
but also
not on
being
screens.
Exposed to stuff that is so deeply upsetting or deeply traumatic in so many ways.
For sure.
In like such a decontextualized way.
Yeah.
It's like cat picture, dead person.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention.
we will be doing poster sessions during this time too. So please feel free to begin looking at the posters, and the presenters will be out there and we'll be happy to talk to you about it. We will be back in here at 11 o'clock. So we're going to start promptly at 11 o'clock.
I didn't quite get the QR code for the first presentation. How do I get the slides?
Because of what they were
Oh, he's good. That's okay. Just ask him the ladies. Programs. I gave you one more bag. Can I have the extra bag? Sure. Oh, hi.